Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single wild Western adventure. Thank you for listening to Ramble Range. Chapter 1. An earth-shattering rumble, deep and resonant, caused young Rip Campbell to twist in his saddle and look back up Rocking Stone Ravine, down which his white Mustang, Grazer, was picking its way with cautious grace toward the inviting coolness of Cartridge Creek. As he did so, a cry of stark horror burst from the cowboy's lips, a sound wrenched from the depths of his being. The huge granite boulder, a behemoth of weathered gray and speckled with mica, which had been so delicately balanced on the rim rock above, the very stone that gave the ravine its ominous name, had become dislodged. Now the monstrous granite chunk, weighing a dozen tons or more, a relic of some ancient glacial epic, was thundering down the narrow defile with a deafening roar that shook the very cliffs on either side of the lone horseman, a primal sound that echoed through the stillness of the afternoon. In an eye blink, a mere fraction of a second, Rip Campbell saw with chilling clarity that he and his magnificent white horse were trapped, caught squarely in the path of the hurtling boulder. "Roll your tail, Grazer, we got to the edge into that wide place there, or we'll be smashed flatter than a tortilla," he yelled, his voice tight with fear, the words barely audible above the growing cacophony. The big white Mustang, a creature of both beauty and remarkable intelligence, leapt forward like the grazer it was named for, responding instantly to the urgent pressure of Rip's spurs. Reining sharply into a hollow which widened the ravine, a small alcove in the unforgiving rock face, horse and rider flattened themselves against the cold stone, clinging to the slim hope of survival, even as the mighty boulder, a force of nature unleashed, catapulted past them in a terrifying rush. Whoosh! With a rush of wind so powerful, it whipped the wide, sweeping gray brim of the cowboy's Stetson. The gigantic rock, a silent killer in its unstoppable descent, zipped on down the ravine at bullet speed, a blur of granite against the backdrop of the canyon walls. A lone pine tree, its 20-inch trunk thick and gnarled, blocked Rocking Stone Ravine a mere dozen yards below the cringing cowboy and his mount. The boulder, a juggernaut of stone, hurtled into the sturdy trunk and snapped it as if it had been a mere toothpick, the sound of splintering wood swallowed by the boulder's roar. Rip Campbell, still pressed tightly against the damp moss-covered cliff wall, as he sat astride his trembling white horse, Grazer, saw the boulder dash on down the ravine and bound out into the open canyon of Cartridge Creek, a sudden and dramatic shift in terrain. Splash! The rocking stone, its journey finally at an end, buried itself forever in the rippling current of the creek, sending sheets of icy spray 50 feet in all directions, a watery explosion that momentarily disrupted the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. "Hold tight, Grazer," panted Rip, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We could still get killed by them small rocks it dislodged." They remained in the precarious protection of the rocky hollow, as a small but still dangerous landslide, a cascade of gravel and smaller rocks dislodged by the mighty glacial chunk which had tumbled from its perilous perch of ages on the rim rock above, pounded down the steep pit of Rocking Stone Ravine, the sound a constant reminder of their near-death experience. When the avalanche, a final, unsettling echo of the larger cataclysm, had finally petered out, the last pebble coming to rest, Rip Campbell, his freckled face pale and drawn from the narrowness of his escape from a horrible death, reined Grazer back into the ravine. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the fine clinging dust kicked up by the rockslide, gilded by the harsh, unfiltered rays of the noonday sun. Gravel and small rocks were still tumbling and rolling down the ravine about Grazer's restless hoofs, a constant subtle tremor in the aftermath. "I wonder what in blazes loosened that stone today," muttered the cowboy, his brow furrowed in thought. Instead of resuming his original course on down to the sparkling creek, where they had planned to quench their thirst after a long morning's ride under the Arizona sun, Rip, a sense of unease settling in his gut, tooled his white Mustang back up toward the flat expanse of the cactus-dotted mesa. "Something fishy about this," muttered the cowboy, his hand instinctively loosening his guns in their intricately crafted holsters. "Just before we entered Rocking Stone Ravine, you acted skittish, like maybe you smelled danger, Grazer." But even a wise horse like you wouldn't smell a loose boulder about to tumble down this gulch. Rip was a wiry young cowboy from the Santa Fe country in New Mexico. Brown and freckled, with a youthful face etched with the lines of hard living, he was just past 22 years of age. His deep chest was clad in a dusty work shirt, faded blue cotton, and a gaudy vest of rainbow-striped Navajo blanket material, a vibrant splash of color against the muted tones of the desert. Disdaining the heavy and uncomfortable bat-wing chaps commonly used by horse twisters in the West, Rip encased his saddle-bowed legs in gray moleskin trousers, practical and durable. There were striking red eagle designs on his well-worn cowboy boots, and the rowels of his gooseneck spurs, gleaming in the sunlight, had been cut star-shaped from genuine Mexican silver dollars. Regulation cartridge belts, heavy with ammunition, crisscrossed his lean waist, the loops filled with gleaming shells. The Colt 6 guns at his thighs were standard peacemaker models, the weapon of choice along the western out trails. But Rip Campbell's holsters, their craftsmanship unique, were the most unusual in all of Arizona. They had been cleverly fashioned from the tanned legs of young calves, so that the polished cloven hoofs were still disturbingly intact to adorn the muzzle ends, a macabre touch of artistry. The white-spotted brown calf hide, supple and well-oiled, had been meticulously molded and sewed to fit the guns they contained like a second skin. As he rode out of the ravine onto the level floor of the mesa, he let his metal blue eyes, sharp and perceptive, range over the shimmering expanse of Scorpion Basin, a vast and unforgiving landscape hemmed in by the jagged circle of desolate peaks forming the old Smoky Mountains. It was a part of the sprawling range of the Ramble Range Ranch, a vast domain in southwestern Arizona near the sun-baked border of Old Mexico. "Let's take a look at the spot where Rocking Stone was, Grazer," muttered the cowboy, dismounting on the rim rock, the ground still vibrating faintly from the boulder's impact. "It was right yonder, as I remember." He saw the place on the very edge of the ravine where the giant glacial rock, a silent sentinel for centuries, had been balanced precariously. A few feet away, half hidden by scrub brush, lay a cedar log, bleached white with age and exposure to the elements, but as tough as seasoned oak. By hell! A man could have used that log for a pry and dislodged Rocking Stone, thought Rip Campbell, a chill running down his spine. A man could have trailed me all morning and I wouldn't have known it. Too bad there ain't any sign to show. Grazer whickered nervously, his ears twitching, and the cowboy whirled around, his senses on high alert. Out of a thick chaparral, a dense tangle of thorny bushes 100 yards from the mouth of the ravine, rode a black-hatted hombre on a bay mare. The horse, its muscles rippling beneath its glossy coat, was trotting directly in their direction. Chapter 2. Rip climbed warily into the saddle, his movements deliberate, every sense on high alert, awaiting the rider's approach. His freckled face, usually open and friendly, was sober with distrust, his brow furrowed in suspicion. Had the approaching horseman, this lone figure emerging from the shimmering heat haze, anything to do with the terrifying, earth-shattering rumble of the rolling boulder which, except for Grazer's lightning-fast hooves and a sliver of good fortune, would have smashed them both to buzzard meat down the unforgiving depths of the ravine? The hombre, a gaunt figure silhouetted against the vast expanse of the basin, drew rein alongside Rip's stirrup, lifting a hand in what was meant to be a friendly greeting. Rip, his eyes narrowed and watchful, saw a narrow dark face, etched with the harsh lines of a hard life, with one bullet-nicked ear, a memento of some past confrontation, and a jagged knife slash, a crimson scar across the right cheek. The hombre had a long, red-wattled neck, thin and corded with a prominent Adam's apple that bobbed nervously, and hands that reminded Rip of a buzzard's claws, bony and grasping. "Howdy, cowboy. You Rip Campbell?" the stranger rasped, his voice dry and scratchy. Rip nodded suspiciously, his gaze unwavering. He wondered with a shiver of unease if this human bag of bones, this unsettling figure before him, would have the strength, the sheer brute force, to overbalance a huge boulder like the monstrous Rocking Stone. He smelled a trap, a carefully laid snare. This long-necked cowpoke, this unsettling individual, could have trailed him across the arid Badlands all morning, unseen and unheard, seen him ride into the ravine, and realized how chillingly easy it would be to slay both horse and rider by simply tipping over the precarious rocking stone. "Yeah, I'm the man," he replied, his voice flat and noncommittal. The stranger, his eyes darting nervously, stuck out a bony palm, thin and pale, which Rip took reluctantly. It was like shaking hands with a corpse, the skin dry and lifeless. "I'm Haywood, the lawyer over to Ferndale town. Tucker Haywood, they call me," the stranger said, a hint of something unpleasant in his tone. "I understand you are the new owner of the Ramble Range ranch, that Chuck Fitzpatrick willed you this spread before he died last week." Rip nodded again, his eyes disapproving the weasel-eyed lawyer, this man who couldn't seem to look him full in the eye. Haywood's gaze flickered everywhere but at Rip, a shifty, unsettling quality to his demeanor. "That's right," Rip confirmed, his voice still guarded. "I've been spending the past week riding over my new ranch, getting to know the land. Sheriff Lyle Durwood helped me hire a gang of honest cowpunchers to run the spread." Haywood, his gaze now fixed on the distant horizon, piled his hands on the worn saddle horn and squinted at the vast, unforgiving range with snake-like eyes, his expression unreadable. The Ramble Range, a sprawling empire of land, was the largest in Scorpion Basin, and that it had suddenly become the property of this hard-riding stranger, this unknown cowboy, had been startling news, a ripple of unease to the folks about Ferndale town. "I represent Chuck Foster, the saloon owner in the county seat," Haywood continued, his voice laced with a hint of something unpleasant, pawing under his dusty coat lapel and producing a legal-looking paper folded and worn. "I'm hoping to talk over some business with you." The cowboy, his mind still replaying the terrifying image of the hurtling boulder, glanced at rocking stone ravine behind him, the dust from the recent avalanche still spiraling lazily up out of the deep split in the mesa, a ghostly reminder of his near demise. "How long you been trailing me this morning?" demanded Rip sharply, his suspicion now fully aroused. "I just escaped getting pancaked by a rolling boulder, and I wondered if you knew what tipped it off the rim rock." Haywood, his face carefully blank, avoided the cowboy's piercing glance. He didn't even glance back up the trail, toward the direction Rip was pointing. "The engine's been expecting rocking stone to topple down that ravine for years," the lawyer evaded, his voice smooth and practiced, a clear attempt to deflect suspicion. "You was plumb foolish to risk riding down to the river under that rock. A strong wind like today's could tip it over." Haywood, his gaze still averted, passed over the paper in his hand as if to change the subject, to distract Rip from his pointed questions. Rip, his eyes narrowed, gave the document a hasty glance, then stared at it hard, his expression hardening. The color rose slowly in his face, a flush of anger creeping up his neck. "This is an order to get off my own ranch," cried the cowboy, his voice laced with indignation. "Who does Chuck Foster figure he is? I got a plumb legal will that makes me sole owner of the Ramble Range." Tucker Haywood, a smirk playing on his lips, shrugged his warped shoulders, thin and hunched, and subtly shifted the weight of a holstered six-gun on his thigh, a movement that did not go unnoticed by Rip. "The Ramble Range ranch is heavily in debt to my client, Chuck Foster," the lawyer returned, his voice dripping with false sympathy. $10,000 to be exact. That money is due within 2 weeks. At midnight on Tuesday, the 15th of this month. Campbell's mouth tightened into a grim line as he read the thinly veiled threat in the lawyer's rat-like face, his features now sharp and calculating. When Rip had gone through the dusty and disorganized books of the late owner of the ranch, Chuck Fitzpatrick, he had learned that Chuck Foster, the seemingly respectable saloon owner, held a mortgage on the sprawling property. But with the fall roundup just around the corner, Rip was confident, or at least he had been, that he could gather the necessary funds and pay off the note. "Foster knows I can't get no cash together on such short notice," protested the cowboy, a sense of injustice burning in his gut. "After I sell my beef, I can meet his danged note." He can't kick me off of this spread without warning." Tucker Haywood, his mission seemingly accomplished, wheeled his bay mare, a lean and rangy animal, and started trotting back in the direction of Ferndale town, the setting sun glinting off the dust devils kicked up by the horse's hooves. "It's all within the limits of the law. This paper is your warning," jeered the Cowtown lawyer over his narrow shoulder, his voice laced with triumph. "That money's due in 2 weeks, and we'll foreclose pronto if you ain't got $10,000 cash on the line by midnight on the 15th. Pay up or get going." Chapter 3. Long after the rhythmic hoof beats of Tucker Haywood's mount had faded on the crisp morning air, Rip Campbell sat astride his saddle, his brow furrowed in thought, as his gaze fixed but unseeing on the worn and weathered papers which the Ferndale saloon owner, Chuck Foster, had sent him. A strange and tragic chain of events, a twist of fate, had put this wiry young cowboy, barely out of his teens, in possession of the biggest ranch in the sprawling Scorpion Basin. Sheriff Lyle Durwood, a man whose word Rip had learned to trust, had confided in him that the saloon keeper, Chuck Foster, a man with a reputation as dark as his soul, was attempting to gain absolute control of the valuable cow country nestled within the jagged peaks of the Big Smokies. Already, Foster's ruthless henchmen, men as cold and calculating as their boss, owned most of the fertile rangeland. The only significant obstacle standing in his way, preventing him from becoming the undisputed cow baron of Scorpion Basin, had been the stubborn and dogged old owner of the vast Ramble Range ranch, Chuck Fitzpatrick, a man who had carved his empire out of the unforgiving landscape. A crooked foreman, a Judas in their midst, had murdered Fitzpatrick in cold blood only a week ago, silencing the rancher's opposition. But the murderer, a pawn in Foster's game, had been unlucky enough to do his dark deed on the very day that fate, in its mysterious workings, had brought Rip Campbell, a roaming young cowboy, honing his skills and eager to rent his lariat to the highest bidder, into the unfolding drama. Fitzpatrick, a man aware that his life was constantly in danger, had, with a foresight born of experience, thwarted his enemies a few short hours before his violent murder, by willing the sprawling spread to Rip Campbell, who was, as fate would have it, the son of Fitzpatrick's oldest and dearest friend, a bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. "Reckon we're about licked, Grazer," groaned Rip Campbell in despair, his voice heavy with the weight of the impossible task before him. "This cash is due Foster by midnight of the 15th, a mere 2 weeks afore our fall roundup. Foster knows no ordinary cowprod like me would have that much money lying around. So I reckon Foster will get the ranch, all right, despite all I can do," he concluded, his voice laced with bitter resignation. Heavy of heart, Rip spurred Grazer, his magnificent white Mustang, into a powerful gallop and headed for the distant ranch house, a mile or so up the winding course of Cartridge Creek. Cowpunchers, their faces weathered and their movements efficient, were already busy with the myriad tasks of getting ready for the crucial fall roundup. Rip knew that a veritable fortune was tied up in the vast herds of prime beef stock which bore the distinctive Ramble Range brand and earmarks, and which they would soon be loading onto cattle cars and shipping to market within the coming month. "I just can't let Foster get his claws onto my spread, just in time to pluck the harvest," snarled the cowboy, his jaw clenched in anger, as he dismounted in front of the trim Spanish-style ranch house, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the midday sun. "Foster knows I could pay off that murder mortgage he holds on this ranch, after I market my steers, after I reap the rewards of months of hard work." Rip dragged himself wearily into the cool interior of the house, his spirit despondent over the bleak outlook, the seemingly insurmountable odds stacked against him. Senora Madera, the warm and motherly Mexican housekeeper, her face creased with concern, brought the rugged young ranch owner a letter bearing a Santa Fe postmark, the familiar scrawl of his adopted father's handwriting instantly recognizable. It was the regular weekly letter from his father, Shane Campbell, a man of the land, a legend in his own right. "By gosh, this gives me a plumb good idea," cried the cowboy, his face lighting up with sudden hope as he finished reading the letter, the words sparking a plan in his mind. Dad just sold his whole Tucker track spread for enough to live easy the rest of his life. I reckon it won't be risking his life savings to lend me $10,000. This Ramble Range is plenty good security to offer him." Feverish with newfound hope, the cowboy, his mind racing, dashed off a heartfelt letter to his grizzled father back in New Mexico, pouring out his plight and pleading for assistance. There would be barely enough time, he knew, for stagecoaches, those lumbering chariots of the West, to carry the urgent letter to Santa Fe and get the desperately needed money back to Scorpion Basin before the fatal deadline when Chuck Foster's mortgage, that instrument of financial doom, came due. "And I can trust that skunk of a Tucker Haywood to have a gun-hung bunch of desperados on hand at midnight on the 15th to make sure I rattle my hawks off the ranch," muttered Rip, a dark cloud of suspicion crossing his features as he strode outside and mounted Grazer, his movements now purposeful. "Reckon I'm going to bust up their little play yet." An hour later, his heart pounding with anticipation, he was loping down the dusty main street of Ferndale, the county seat of Scorpion Basin, a town with a reputation as one of the wildest and most lawless cow towns along the unforgiving border. As Rip Campbell rode between the rows of ramshackle, false-fronted stores, their paint peeling and their signs faded, his sharp eye came to rest upon a Concord stagecoach, its faded red paint peeling, hitched behind a powerful six-horse team, the magnificent animals stamping impatiently. The coach, a vital Lyle to the outside world, would shortly leave for Phoenix, and had stopped at Ferndale only long enough to change teams and drivers, a brief respite in its arduous journey, and to load and discharge mail and passengers. Galloping up to the shanty which housed the Ferndale post office, a rough-hewn building with a faded sign, Rip trailed his spurs inside, the sound echoing in the small space, and approached the goat-whiskered clerk, a man as thin and wiry as a desert weed, who was busily canceling stamped letters, preparing them to be put in the mail sack for the outgoing stagecoach. "This here letter is danged important," panted the cowboy, his voice urgent. "I simply got to get it off on today's stage. Will you make sure she leaves okay?" The clerk, his eyes narrowed and suspicious, nodded curtly, and Rip, a burden momentarily lifted from his mind, made his way outside and headed for a general store to buy some much-needed supplies for the ranch. A weight was off his mind, and a cheery whistle, a rare sound in these trying times, was on his lips as he bow-legged his way across the wheel-rutted street, his thoughts now focused on the hope of his father's timely assistance. But the smile would have faded quickly, replaced by a grimace of understanding, if he had chanced to read the small, unassuming sign just below the larger, bolder words, U.S. Post Office, Ferndale, Aries, above the post office door. For the rest of the sign, in much smaller, less noticeable letters, read, Tucker Haywood, Postmaster and Lawyer. Chapter 4. Inside the dimly lit post office, Tucker Haywood, his narrow shoulders hunched over a cluttered desk, was busily catching up with the distribution of the Ferndale mail, a task he had neglected while returning from his surreptitious ride out to the Ramble Range that very morning. Hearing the familiar, youthful voice of Rip Campbell addressing his perpetually harried mail clerk, Tucker, a man who preferred the shadows, kept out of sight, lurking in the back room, until he was absolutely certain the young cowpuncher had left the building. Then, with a predatory gleam in his beady eyes, he hurried over to his assistant's cluttered bench, his movements quick and furtive like a rat scenting cheese. "Where's that letter Campbell brought in just now?" he asked hoarsely, his voice raspy. "If it's extra special, I reckon I better take care of it myself," he added, a thin veneer of official concern masking his true intentions. The perpetually harried, goat-whiskered clerk, Lem, without looking up from his work, handed him the envelope addressed to Rip Campbell's father, Shane Campbell, in Santa Fe. Grinning like a cat that had just cornered a particularly plump mouse, Tucker Haywood, the picture of barely contained glee, hurried into his cramped and untidy living quarters behind the post office proper, a space that smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. A battered tea kettle, its surface stained with mineral deposits, was spouting a plume of white steam on Haywood's small, wood-burning stove. Taking the letter over to the jet of hot vapor, the crooked postmaster, his fingers nimble and practiced, carefully loosened the flap of the envelope and opened it with practiced ease. Rip's bold, distinctive handwriting, sprawling across the page, read, "Howdy, Dad. I've already written you about how your old amigo Chuck Fitzpatrick was killed by a bunch of skunks and how he willed the big Ramble Range ranch to me. Well, I found out this morning from a Cowtown lawyer who's got a yellow stripe down his backbone and a smell of skunk oil about him, that I'm in danger of losing this ranch before I've even had a chance to ride from boundary to boundary. The lay is this. It seems a certain hombre here named Chuck Foster is out to control the Scorpion Basin cow country. He holds a $10,000 mortgage against the Ramble Range, and it's due midnight on the 15th. He says he'll kick me off the ranch if it isn't paid in full on the dot. If you can spare that much money, Dad, old pard, shoot it out by return stagecoach. I don't feel sheepish about asking for this loan, because the Ramble Range is plenty good security in itself, and I'll clear that much after the roundup. Your son and partner, Rip." Tucker Haywood's narrow face, already etched with the lines of greed and malice, lighted villainously as he slowly and deliberately returned the incriminating paper to its envelope. But instead of resealing the letter, the crook, a master of deception, ducked out the back door of the post office, crossed a weed-grown and neglected vacant lot, and knocked discreetly at the rear exit of the notorious Spurs and Saddles Saloon, the heart of Ferndale's less reputable activities. The door, heavy and reinforced, was opened by a huge hombre, a mountain of a man with a gaudy vest, its bright colors clashing with the grime on his skin, a diamond horseshoe pin, large and ostentatious, gleaming in his soiled red tie, and double guns worn low on his hips, strapped menacingly to his broad waist. Up the black sleeves of the hombre's coat, Haywood knew, were kept a brace of stubby-nosed derringers, small but deadly. "Chuck, I just swiped a letter that Rip Campbell is rushing to his old man in Santa Fe. It's plumb interesting," Haywood whispered conspiratorially. "He aims to get that money and pay you off before the deadline, after all. We shouldn't have warned him this way," he finished, a note of anxiety creeping into his voice. Chuck Foster, owner of the saloon and gambling dive, a man whose reputation preceded him like a foul stench, seized the letter from Haywood's outstretched hand and read it swiftly, his eyes narrowing. Foster had a round, moon face, pale and fleshy, with greasy black hair combed and oiled down slick against his skull, giving him the appearance of a particularly well-fed rat. His nose was thick and bulbous, and a frayed cigar, its end perpetually wet and chewed, was perpetually lodged in one corner of his flabby lips. A double chin, evidence of his indulgent lifestyle, folded down over his soiled wing collar, and gaudy jewels, large and tasteless, glittered on his stubby fingers. "I advise you, as your lawyer," hissed Haywood, his voice low and urgent, "to burn that letter. Then the money won't arrive, and you'll get the Ramble Range title, and with it the control of the Scorpion Basin cow country, same as you've been wanting," he concluded, his eyes gleaming with avarice. Foster, his face impassive, spouted a cloud of blue smoke from his nostrils, the acrid smell filling the small office, and his eyes, cold and calculating, shone with triumph as he thoughtfully folded Campbell's letter and returned it to the envelope. Haywood, his hands clasped together in anticipation, rubbed them together briskly and smirked, a picture of barely contained greed. "Of course, I'll have to charge you a fee for intercepting this letter out of my post office," he wheedled, his voice oily. "You're darn lucky to have a lawyer in a position to get his claws on your enemy's correspondence, Chuck," he continued, his tone suggesting this was a service Foster should be grateful for. "As it is, Rip won't suspect you destroyed his letter until it's too late to save his ranch, and even then he won't know the letter went astray at this post office," he finished, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. Chuck Foster, ignoring Haywood's grasping tone, walked over to an antique roll-top desk, its surface scratched and worn, got out a pot of thick mucilage, its label peeling, and carefully resealed the letter to Buckaroo Rip, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He handed it to the slack-jawed postmaster, a sneer curling his thick lips, revealing cracked and yellow teeth. "For an hombre that calls himself a lawyer, sometimes I think you're pretty dumb, Haywood," commented Foster in his cold, even voice, his words laced with contempt. "You see that this letter gets on today's stage without fail, savvy? And you better register it," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Haywood's Adam's apple, large and prominent, chased up and down his scrawny neck nervously. "But you don't want Rip to get that money, do you?" gasped the lawyer, his face etched with confusion. "You want me to foreclose on him, don't you? That Ramble Range ranch is worth more than $10,000 to you. Can't you see that?" Chuck Foster, unperturbed, flicked ash from his wet cigar with a thick finger, the glowing ember falling onto the worn carpet. "Of course, you danged fool," he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've been aiming to get control of the Ramble Range for years. But this here letter will bring $10,000 in cold cash, and I intend that cash will never get into Campbell's hands, see?" He explained patiently, as if talking to a particularly dense child. A wide, avaricious grin broke on Haywood's narrow features, understanding finally dawning. He turned and hurried out of Foster's private office, his earlier confusion replaced by a renewed sense of purpose, to make absolutely sure Campbell's letter would get on its way, unaware of the further machinations of his cunning employer. But Foster, a man of many layers of deceit, had even more schemes up his sleeve, plans within plans. Not only did he want Campbell's ranch and his money, but Foster was out to get his life as well, eliminating him as a threat once and for all. Going to the door of his barroom, Foster, his face hard, called in one of his paid gunmen, a gorilla-like hombre, a hulking brute named Jim Dupar, a French-Canadian migrant who had killed a cowboy in Montana and had fled south to escape a sheriff's posse, a past that made him the perfect tool for Foster's dirty work. "What you want, boss?" asked Dupar, his gray stubbled face eager and expectant as he rubbed the filed stocks of his triggerless 6 guns, his movements suggesting he was ready for action. "You want the hombre killed this morning, out?" "I crave a little excitement," he finished, a hint of menace in his voice. Chuck Foster, his expression unchanging, rolled his cigar in his mouth, etched in a permanent grimace. "I've got a plan," he snarled. Chapter 5. The air in the Spurs and Saddles saloon hung thick with the smells of stale beer, cheap perfume, and desperation. Rip, his mind a whirlwind of mortgage deadlines and missing money, barely registered the cacophony of piano music and drunken laughter. He'd come to Ferndale for supplies, a brief respite from the relentless work on the Ramble Range, but the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him like the desert sun. He needed a drink, something to dull the sharp edges of his worry. He bellied up to the bar, ordering a whiskey, his gaze drifting across the crowded room. Cowboys jostled for space, their spurs clicking on the wooden floor, their voices a boisterous mix of boasts and tall tales. A cloud of smoke hung near the ceiling, illuminated by the flickering gas lamps. It was a scene as familiar as the dust on his boots, yet tonight it felt different, heavier. Then he saw her. She wasn't like the other saloon girls, their painted smiles hard and practiced. This one, perched on a stool near the piano, had an air of quiet defiance about her. Her dress, though revealing, wasn't tawdry. It was a deep crimson, and though it couldn't hide the weariness in her eyes, it hinted at a hidden fire. Her hair, a cascade of dark curls, was pulled back loosely, framing a face that was both delicate and strong. She wasn't laughing or flirting like the others. She was simply listening to the music, a melancholic tune that seemed to echo her own inner thoughts. Rip found himself drawn to her, an inexplicable pull that tugged at his attention. He finished his whiskey, ordered another, and found his gaze wandering back to her. She caught him looking, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze, sadness, yes, but also intelligence and a spark of something else. He couldn't quite name it. He hesitated, unsure whether to approach. He wasn't usually one for striking up conversations with saloon girls, but there was something about her that intrigued him, a sense of vulnerability beneath the surface. He took a deep breath and walked over, the seal-iling of his spurs the only sound in the sudden lull in the piano music. "Evening," he said, his voice a little rough. She looked up at him, her eyes assessing him quickly. "Cowboy," she replied, her voice soft but with a hint of steel. "Rip Campbell," he offered, extending a hand. She glanced at his hand, then back at his face. "Lily," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't take his hand. He shrugged slightly, undeterred. He sat on the stool next to her, the worn leather creaking beneath his weight. "Nice tune," he said, gesturing towards the piano player, a hunched figure with nimble fingers. "It's Chopin," she said. "He was Polish." Rip raised an eyebrow. "You know about that stuff." She gave him a look that suggested he'd underestimated her. "I know a few things," she said. He chuckled. "I can see that." They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the swirling mass of bodies on the dance floor. Rip ordered another whiskey, and Lily surprised him by asking for one too. She sipped it slowly, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the saloon walls. "You're new in town, aren't you?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Rip nodded. "Just got in a few weeks ago." "I've seen you around," she said. "You own the Ramble Range, right?" He nodded again, surprised she knew. News traveled fast in a small town like Ferndale. "Big place," she said. "Heard it's a hard go." Rip sighed. "It's got its challenges." He didn't elaborate, not wanting to burden her with his troubles. But he sensed that she understood, that she knew about the mortgage, about Foster's looming threat. "This town, it's not for everyone," she said, her voice wistful. Rip looked at her, studying her face in the dim light. "You want to leave?" She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a longing that mirrored his own. "More than anything," she whispered. Just then, a heavy hand landed on Rip's shoulder. He turned to see Chuck Foster standing behind him, his face a mask of displeasure. "Rip," Foster said, his voice thick with menace. "I didn't know you were acquainted with Lily." He put a possessive arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She flinched slightly, her eyes darting towards Rip, a flicker of fear in their depths. "Just having a friendly conversation," Rip replied, his voice even. Foster's eyes narrowed. "Lily's my responsibility," he said, his grip tightening on her shoulder. "She understands that." Lily looked down, her face pale. She didn't say a word. Rip's jaw tightened. He knew what Foster meant. He owned her, just like he thought he owned everything else in Ferndale. He looked at Lily, his eyes searching hers. He saw the desperation there, the trapped animal longing for escape. He knew, in that moment, that he had to help her. Chapter 6. The memory of Lily's fear-stricken eyes lingered in Rip's mind long after he left the Spurs and Saddles saloon. He rode back to the Ramble Range under a sky studded with a million stars, but his gaze was fixed inward, on the image of Lily trapped in Foster's grasp. He understood her longing for escape. He felt it himself, the weight of responsibility, the sense of being cornered. He knew what it was like to have someone hold something over your head, to feel your freedom slipping away. He thought about his father's letter, the hope it represented, the slim chance of salvation for the Ramble Range. But even if the money arrived, even if he managed to pay off the mortgage, the image of Lily would haunt him. He couldn't just leave her there, at Foster's mercy. The next day, Rip rode into Ferndale with a purpose. He needed to talk to Lily, to understand her situation, to find a way to help her. He knew it was risky, that Foster would be watching, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed her something, a debt he couldn't quite define. He found her in the saloon, earlier than usual, the room almost empty save for a few early drinkers nursing their regrets. She was sitting at the bar, polishing glasses, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wary. "Rip," she said, her voice barely audible. "Lily," he replied, taking the stool next to her. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, glancing nervously around the room. "Foster, he's expecting me," she said. "I won't keep you long," Rip said. I wanted to know what you're planning." Lily sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Planning?" she echoed, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "I'm planning on surviving another day, another week. That's about all I can manage." "You said you wanted to leave," Rip reminded her. "You said this town wasn't for you." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the glass she was polishing. "It's a dream," she said. "A foolish dream." "Dreams can come true," Rip said, his voice firm. "But you have to fight for them." Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his. "What do you know about fighting?" she asked. "Enough," Rip said. "Enough to know that giving up is never the answer." He told her about the Ramble Range, about the mortgage, about Foster's hold on him. He didn't expect her to understand, but he needed to confide in someone, and she seemed to be the only one who would listen without judgment. "So you're fighting for your ranch," she said when he'd finished. Rip nodded. "And you're fighting for your freedom," he said. Lily gave him a sad smile. "My freedom is a long shot," she said. "Foster, he owns me, Rip. He owns everything in this town." "He doesn't own you," Rip said, his voice low and intense. "No one owns you, Lily. You're stronger than you think." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle. She didn't pull away. "Tell me about your dream," he said. "Tell me where you want to go." Lily hesitated, then began to speak, her voice gaining strength as she talked about a small town she'd heard about, a place where she could start over, where she could be someone else. She talked about opening a small dress shop, about designing beautiful gowns, about finally being independent. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, the weariness momentarily gone. Rip listened, his heart aching for her. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that Foster wouldn't let her go without a fight. But he also knew that he had to try. He had to help her escape, just like he was fighting for his own escape. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm. "I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way." Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You would do that?" she whispered. "I would," Rip said. "You deserve a chance, Lily. Everyone does." Just then, the saloon door swung open, and Foster walked in. He saw Rip and Lily sitting together, their hands clasped, and his face darkened with anger. He strode towards them, his eyes narrowed. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice thick with menace. Lily flinched, her hand pulling away from Rip's. "Just having a friendly chat," Rip said, his voice even. Foster's gaze flickered between them, his suspicion evident. "Friendly chat," he sneered. "I don't like it." He grabbed Lily's arm, his grip tight. "You know better than this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Lily looked at Rip, her eyes pleading. She didn't say a word. Foster pulled her away, his eyes never leaving Rip's. "Stay away from her, Rip," he warned. "She's mine." Rip's jaw tightened. He knew he couldn't challenge Foster here, not in his own saloon. But he also knew that he wouldn't give up. He would find a way to help Lily, no matter the cost. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. Chapter 7. Foster's warning hung in the air, a thick, suffocating blanket of threat. Rip watched as he dragged Lily away, her face pale and drawn, her eyes reflecting a fear that mirrored his own. He knew Foster wouldn't take this lightly. He'd seen the possessive glint in his eyes, the way he treated Lily like property, something to be owned and controlled. It fueled a fire in Rip, a righteous anger that burned hotter than the desert sun. He left the saloon, the raucous sounds of music and laughter grating on his nerves. He needed to think, to devise a plan. He couldn't just storm in and rescue Lily. That would only put her in more danger. He had to be smart, to find a way to outmaneuver Foster, to loosen his grip on her. He rode back to the Ramble Range, the vast expanse of the ranch a stark contrast to the cramped confines of the saloon. The land stretched out before him, wild and untamed, a symbol of the freedom he was fighting for. He thought of Lily, her dreams of a new life, her yearning for independence. He understood that longing, that desperate need to escape. He spent the rest of the day in a restless haze, his mind preoccupied with Lily's plight. He tried to focus on the ranch, on the upcoming roundup, on the looming mortgage deadline. But Lily's face kept intruding, her image a constant reminder of the promise he had made. That evening, he rode back into Ferndale, the town bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. He went straight to the saloon, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to see Lily, to reassure her that he hadn't forgotten her. The saloon was bustling, the air thick with smoke and noise. He scanned the crowd, searching for her familiar crimson dress. But she wasn't there. He approached the bartender, a burly man with a handlebar mustache. "Have you seen Lily?" he asked. The bartender shrugged. "Foster took her somewhere," he said. "I don't know where." Rip's gut clenched. "Took her," he repeated, his voice tight. "Where?" The bartender shrugged again. "He didn't say. He just took her." Rip's mind raced. Where would Foster take her? He thought of the small room above the saloon, the place where Foster kept his private stock, a place where he often entertained women. A wave of nausea washed over him. He left the saloon, his anger simmering just below the surface. He walked across the street to the sheriff's office, the only place in town where he might find some semblance of justice. But Durwood was out of town, still searching for a band of rustlers who had been plaguing the local ranches. Rip was on his own. He returned to the saloon, his resolve hardening. He had to find Lily, to make sure she was safe. He pushed through the swinging doors, his eyes scanning the room, searching for any clue, any hint of her whereabouts. He spotted Foster sitting at a table in the back, surrounded by his cronies. He was laughing, his face flushed with drink. Rip walked towards him, his footsteps deliberate, his gaze unwavering. "Where's Lily?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Foster looked up, his eyes narrowing. "That's none of your concern, Rip," he said, his voice laced with arrogance. "It is my concern," Rip said. "She's my friend." Foster chuckled. "Friend? You think you're her friend? You think you can save her?" "I'm going to try," Rip said. Foster stood up, his face inches from Rip's. "You're playing a dangerous game, Rip," he said. "You're messing with things you don't understand." "Maybe," Rip said. "But I understand one thing. You're not going to hurt her." Foster's eyes flashed with anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, a commotion erupted near the front of the saloon. A group of cowboys had gathered, their voices raised in anger. "That's her," one of them shouted, pointing towards the stairs leading to Foster's private room. "We heard her screaming." Rip's heart leapt. He knew what he had to do. He turned and ran towards the stairs, the sound of the cowboys' shouts echoing behind him. He burst through the door at the top of the stairs, his guns drawn. Foster's room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of cheap perfume and stale cigar smoke. Lily was huddled in a corner, her face bruised and tear-streaked. Foster stood over her, his face contorted with rage. "Get out of here, Rip," he snarled. "This is none of your business." "It is now," Rip said, his voice cold and hard. "You're not touching her again." Foster lunged at him, his fists clenched. Rip sidestepped the attack and grabbed Foster's arm, twisting it behind his back. Foster cried out in pain. "Leave her alone," Rip said, his voice unwavering. He shoved Foster towards the door, then turned to Lily. "Come on," he said, extending his hand. "Let's get you out of here." Chapter 8. The commotion downstairs echoed faintly as Rip led Lily out of Foster's private room. The cowboys who had heard her screams parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of anger and concern. Lily, still shaken, clung to Rip's arm, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was a bird finally released from its cage, but the cage, though open, still loomed large in her mind. "We need to get you out of here," Rip said, his voice low and urgent. He knew Foster wouldn't let this go. He'd be back, probably with his cronies, and a full-blown brawl in the saloon was the last thing they needed. "Where can I go?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Somewhere safe," Rip replied. He thought of the Ramble Range, but that was too far, too exposed. He needed something closer, a temporary haven. "The stagecoach," Lily said suddenly, her eyes widening. "It's leaving for Phoenix tomorrow morning." Rip's heart leapt. It was perfect. Phoenix was far enough away, a clean break from Ferndale and Foster's clutches. It was a chance for Lily to start over, to build the life she had dreamed of. "That's it," Rip said, his voice filled with hope. "That's exactly what we'll do." He led her downstairs, the cowboys watching them with a mixture of curiosity and approval. Foster was nowhere to be seen, probably licking his wounds and plotting his revenge. Rip knew they didn't have much time. He took Lily to the back door of the saloon, away from the prying eyes of the patrons. "We need to get you some things," he said. "Clothes, money." Lily shook her head. "I don't have anything," she said, her voice filled with despair. "Foster, he took everything." "Don't worry," Rip said. "I'll take care of it." He left her there, promising to return soon, and hurried across the street to the general store. He bought her a sturdy traveling dress, a warm shawl, and a small valise to carry her belongings. He also withdrew some cash from his dwindling savings, enough for her to get started in Phoenix. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He returned to the saloon, his arms laden with supplies. Lily was waiting for him, her face etched with worry. "Here," he said, handing her the valise. "These are for you." Lily opened the valise, her eyes widening as she saw the dress and the shawl. She looked at Rip, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Don't thank me yet," Rip said. "We still have to get you on that stagecoach." He knew it wouldn't be easy. Foster would be watching, waiting for his chance to reclaim his property. Rip had to be smart, to find a way to get Lily out of town without Foster interfering. He thought of Sheriff Durwood, still out of town, his presence sorely missed. He needed someone to help him, someone who could stand up to Foster. Then he remembered Tipper, the bartender, the man Foster had pinked during the earlier altercation with Dupar. Tipper owed him a favor, and Rip intended to collect. He found Tipper behind the bar, nursing a bruised arm. "I need your help," Rip said, his voice urgent. Tipper looked at him warily. "Foster, he's not happy with you," he said. "I know," Rip said. "But this is important. It's about Lily." He explained the situation to Tipper, telling him about Lily's dream of leaving Ferndale, about Foster's hold on her. Tipper listened, his expression softening. "I'll help you," he said finally. "Lily deserves a chance." Together, they devised a plan. Tipper would distract Foster, keeping him occupied while Rip escorted Lily to the stagecoach. It was a risky plan, but it was their only chance. The next morning, Rip and Lily met at the back of the saloon, the pre-dawn darkness offering them a sliver of cover. Tipper was already at work, polishing glasses and preparing for the day. "Are you ready?" Rip asked Lily, his voice low. She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Let's go," Rip said. He took her hand, and together they slipped out the back door and into the alley, their footsteps echoing softly in the stillness of the morning. The stagecoach was waiting for them, its horses stamping impatiently. The driver, A grizzled old man named Joe was loading the last of the luggage. Rip helped Lily into the coach, then turned to Joe. "Take care of her," he said, handing him a wad of cash. "Make sure she gets to Phoenix safely." Joe nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. Just then, Foster appeared at the end of the alley, his face a mask of fury. He had seen them. "Lily!" he roared, his voice echoing through the quiet streets. Rip stepped in front of Lily, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "She's leaving, Foster," he said, his voice cold and hard. Foster lunged at him, his fists clenched. Rip sidestepped the attack and grabbed Foster's arm, twisting it behind his back. Foster cried out in pain. "Get on the coach, Lily," Rip shouted. Lily hesitated for a moment, then climbed into the coach. Rip shoved Foster towards the ground, then turned to face him. "Stay away from her," he warned. "If you ever come near her again, I'll kill you." He climbed into the coach, slamming the door shut. "Let's go, Joe," he shouted. The stagecoach lurched forward, its wheels rumbling on the cobblestones. Rip looked back at Foster, his face a picture of rage. He knew he hadn't seen the last of him. But for now, Lily was safe. She was on her way to a new life, a life free from Foster's control. And that was all that mattered. Chapter 9. Rip emerged from the general store, his arms loaded with supplies he needed out at the ranch. Crossing the street to where he had tied Grazer, the cowboy proceeded to load his purchases into saddlebags. He had hoped to visit his friend, Sheriff Lyle Durwood, but had learned that the lawman was out of town chasing rustlers with a posse. "Reckon I need some loads for my artillery," decided the Ramble Range owner, glancing down at the empty loops on his shell belts. "Hard telling when I'll have time to come to town again, with work piling up on the ranch. Might as well stock up now." Rip glanced across the street to see the adobe-walled, false-fronted Spurs and Saddles saloon, owned by Chuck Foster. He had never seen Foster, the gambler whom he suspected of being his enemy. Therefore, he decided to buy his needed cartridges in Foster's establishment, on the chance that he might get to see the famous saloon man in person. He'll be plumb surprised that a poor cowhand from Santa Fe, who didn't even have a job a week ago, will soon be paying him off in full before the mortgage deadline, chuckled Rip Campbell as he headed for Foster's saloon. "I won't give Foster any hint that I'm getting the money until foreclosure time comes." Rip knew his adopted father too well to be nervous about Buckaroo Rip failing to send the money by return stagecoach in time to save the Ramble Range from Foster's clutches. The usual crowd of loafers were whittling and drowsing on the shady porch. The clean-limbed young ranch owner disregarded their stares as he headed for the green, slatted swing doors of Chuck Foster's barroom. Inside, the cowboy found swampers busy sprinkling fresh sawdust over the floor. Mexican mozos were busy cleaning the card room in preparation for a night's work for the poker and faro dealers, the roulette wheel, and the craps table. Disregarding the rest of the barflies who lined the brass rail in front of the counter, Rip made his way toward the end of the room where guns, ammunition, saddles, and fishing tackle were sold. The red-mustached bartender waddled his fat bulk over to him, as if he resented the approach of a customer to disturb his doze behind the bar. "What'll it be, stranger?" he demanded sourly. Rip Campbell grinned at the surly reception. He was in too good spirits this afternoon to take offense easily. "2 boxes of pistol shells, and 2 more boxes for my rifle." As the bartender turned to the shelves to hunt for the desired cartridges, a gorilla-faced hombre emerged from a door by the back bar, and his gaze widened as he looked at Rip. "Wait, tipper," grunted the hombre, striding across the room toward the bartender. "I'll wait on this man, Rip leaned against the gun counter and repeated his order to Chuck Foster's chief bodyguard, Jim Dupar. The cowboy was quick to notice that the Frenchman had no triggers in his .45s. This meant, to a cowboy of Rip's experience, that Dupar was a fanner. He clicked the hammer of his 6-gun with the heel of one palm, thereby firing a burst of 6 shots in half the time it would take even an expert gunslinger to pull a trigger 6 times. It was a method of gunplay, having advantages only to crooks who operated at close range. A man's aim could not be accurate while fanning a 6-gun, but bullets could be got off in a hurry when a Colt had its triggers filed off. Jim Dupar piled the boxes of ammunition before Rip. The latter reached in his moleskin pants and drew out a $20 gold piece, which he spun on the counter in front of the ugly-faced man. Dupar picked up the glittering new coin and eyed it suspiciously. Then he opened a cash drawer under the counter. "What's the matter, friend?" asked Rip casually, as he saw Dupar halt in the act of counting change. "The matter," thundered Dupar, in a voice which made every customer in the saloon turn and look. "You dirty sidewinder, you try for to palm off the brass coin on me, yes?" Rip went white about the mouth. His brow gathered threateningly. "Button your lip, Busky, before you go calling me names. Hand me back my $20 gold piece. Bang it on the counter. You can prove it's genuine by the ring." Grinning nastily from the corner of his mouth, Jim Dupar tossed a yellow metal disc on the counter in front of Rip. It was a tarnished, cheap counterfeit. "You got other money in that poke. Pay me in silver money," snarled Jim Dupar. "We don't deal with fake cash here." Anger stained Rip's face a crimson hue as he saw through the trick. "That ain't the coin I just gave you," rasped the cowboy, pinpoints of fire dancing in his eyes. "I don't know what game you're up to, hombre, but you better trot my money back pronto before I come back of that counter after it." Jim Dupar laughed, as if Rip's defiance was what he was after. He had tried to goad the cowboy into a fury, and he had succeeded. "You ask for the belly full of bullets, you skunk. So here it comes, yes." Rip Campbell saw in a clipped heartbeat what Dupar was planning to do. The crooked bodyguard had a 3-foot counter between him and Rip, so that he was out of the cowboy's reach. Dupar was going for his gun. The shocked onlookers of the drama by the gun counter did not see the smooth, flawless draw of Rip. One instant, the cowboy from open range was standing crouched by the counter, his eyes following Dupar's hand as it jerked one triggerless Colt pistol from its holster. In the split second that it took Dupar to reach his other hand across his body to fan the hammer of the leveled 6-gun, Rip went into action. His palms struck the custom butts of his Colts together. Out of the strange calf-leg holsters leapt the guns in a draw too fast for the eye to follow. Bang! 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 The thunder of 3 guns shattered the tense stillness of the saloon. Rip's right-hand gun blazed slugs into Dupar's flaming weapon, deflecting the killer's gun enough to send a burst of lead into the counter. At the same time, the cowboy's left-hand gun drove a lead slug through Dupar's stomach. Gunsmoke swam lazily about Rip as he leapt sidewise, his double gun still covering Dupar. The Colt had been knocked from Dupar's hand, but he was not reaching for the other weapon belted to his hip. Instead, the hombre Chuck Foster had sent out with orders to kill Rip was now swaying on his feet, both hands clawing at the spouting crimson fountain above his belt buckle. Then Dupar toppled out of sight behind the counter. For an instant after the crash of Dupar's dead body, silence gripped the barroom. Then Tipper, the fat bartender with the bristling red mustache, let out a bellow like a wounded longhorn. "Get that jigger," he yelled. "Salivate that murderer." Rip's scalp prickled as he saw the room suddenly become alive with Chuck Foster's paid gunmen. The swampers dropped mops to claw guns from holsters. The mozos cleaning up the gambling hall tipped tables over and were jumping behind them to get out of line of crisscrossing bullets. "Drop that scattergun." Rip yelled the words as he ran straight for the bar, where the red-mustached keeper was hauling a sawed-off shotgun from under the bar. Rip was forced to crease the bartender's fat shoulder as Tipper triggered the double-barreled weapon. The whistling shot missed Rip Campbell and demolished a hanging lamp above him. Behind the bar, the keeper was squeezing his wounded shoulder with a fat hand. Everybody in the room reached for the sky. Campbell's ringing command halted 3 swampers by the door in the act of cocking their 6 guns. Rip knew he was trapped, that it would take fast thinking and faster gunplay to get out of Foster's saloon alive. He headed for the batwing doors opening on the street, then halted. Shadows on the porch floor outside told the bait puncher that Foster's crooked bodyguards lay in wait for him outside those swinging doors, guns out of leather, and waiting to fill him with lead as he sped toward his waiting horse. Rip was coolest in times of greatest peril. Now, in the most dangerous moment of his life, he thought fast. Outdoors, killers were waiting for him to attempt flight. The windows were closed. He knew he could not count on safety inside the bar. At any instant, one of the stragglers in the adjoining gambling hall might begin firing on him. To dart into the private office behind the bar would be jumping from the frying pan into the fire. The only other avenue of escape was a door in the gambling den. Would it lead outside into an alley? Triggering a slug through the chest of a gunslinger who was drawing a bead on him across an overturned dice table, Rip fled like a deer for the gambling room. After him bellowed the wounded bartender. The cowboy's retreat was the signal for the swampers in the barroom to start shooting. But their bullets were wild, slamming into the wall along which Rip was racing. The cowboy skidded to a halt by the door opening off the gambling room wall. If it led to the outdoors, he was saved. Opening the door with one hand, he triggered a hail of slugs at his foes in the barroom with the pistol in his other hand. Then he leapt backward across the threshold and shut the door. With a gasp, he found himself in total darkness instead of in a rear alley as he supposed. Slugs were hammering into the door, but not penetrating its thick panels. Panting like a landed trout, Rip pulled a match from the snakeskin band about his sombrero and struck a light. Horror chilled his veins as he saw where he was. He had jumped into Foster's liquor closet, a room without windows, as impossible to get out of as a bank vault. He was trapped, with a howling wolf pack of killers outside that doorway, bent on slaying him. Chapter 10. Outside the thick oaken door of the wine vault, the muffled voices of Foster's killer crew sounded ghostly and far away, distorted by the heavy wood and the thick stone walls. By the guttering, flickering flame of the match in his trembling hand, Rip saw the towering barrels of whiskey and beer, the neatly stacked bottled wines and gins which tiered the walls of the closet, a veritable arsenal of intoxicating delights. He ejected the empty shells from his trusty Colt peacemakers and reloaded them with practiced ease from his well-worn belt loops. If he had to stand off a siege, a grim prospect indeed, he was bitterly sorry he hadn't snatched up the extra ammunition he had been in the act of buying from the treacherous proprietor before all hell had broken loose. Rip struck another match, the sulphurous head flaring briefly before catching. There was a lone, half-melted wax candle stuck on a piece of bent tin, crudely nailed shelf-fashion to the inside of the door. He carefully lighted it, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows that played across the stacked bottles, then hunted frantically for a way of locking the door, any way to secure his precarious sanctuary. It was equipped with no bar or lock on the inside, a chilling realization. That meant that the gang outside of those doors could lock him in, a cruel irony, but he had no way of keeping them out, a far more terrifying prospect. "They're out having a council of war now," panted Rip, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face glossy with sweat in the meager yellow rays of the candle. "They got me in here like a cornered rat, trapped and vulnerable so they don't have to hurry," he muttered to himself, the thought a cold knot in his stomach. Knowing that the inevitable attack, brutal and swift, would not be long in coming, Rip, his mind racing, rolled a heavy whiskey keg, its wood dark and damp, over to the door, and by a stroke of desperate luck, found that it fitted snugly under the massive ornate doorknob, a temporary but hopefully sufficient barricade. That, together with the considerable thickness of the door itself, protected him, he hoped, against anything short of a battering ram that would rip the door from its hinges, a terrifying image. Air seeped through the cracks in the uneven floor, carrying the chill of the earth, and already Rip was shivering with cold, the dampness seeping into his bones. A storage vault for liquor, he thought grimly, was not exactly a warm place to hide in, especially when facing a determined and hostile mob. These walls, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper, are thin enough to puncture with rifle bullets, a chilling thought, as he glanced about him nervously, his eyes darting from barrel to bottle to the thin wooden walls. Foster will either try to starve me out, a slow and agonizing death, or gun me down that way, a quicker but equally certain end. He grinned bitterly, a humorless twist of his lips, as he thought things over, his mind replaying the events that had led him to this perilous predicament. It was all clear enough, the way he had been so skillfully baited into a barroom brawl, a carefully orchestrated trap. Dupar, Foster's thuggish gunman, had conveniently stepped out of Foster's office, seemingly by chance, to wait on Rip at the bar. It was more than probable, the cowboy figured, that Dupar, a man known for his violent temper, had been ordered by Foster, the calculating mastermind, to get the new owner of the Ramble Range, to eliminate him as a rival. There sounded a hammering of knuckles on the thick door, a loud and insistent rapping, and a nasal grating voice which Rip recognized with a sinking heart as coming from Tucker Haywood, Foster's weasel-faced lawyer, came to the trapped prisoner's ears. "Better toss out your hog legs when we open this door," Haywood's voice sneered. "I'll guarantee you won't be shot down, not right away anyway. We'll turn you over to the sheriff for a fair trial," the lawyer finished, the words laced with a clear and thinly veiled threat. Rip's heart leapt with a sudden, desperate hope, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. Lyle Durwood, the sheriff of Ferndale, a man of integrity and Rip's only real friend in a range that swarmed with foes, was a beacon of justice in a sea of corruption. Perhaps Durwood, Rip thought desperately, had heard the crackle of gunfire, the chaotic sounds of violence, in the Spurs and Saddles saloon, and would come to his rescue, arriving in the nick of time. Then he recalled, with a sinking, sickening feeling, that Durwood was out of town, away on official business. There would be no hope of rescue there, no deus ex machina to save him from his perilous situation. "What you got against me, Haywood?" shouted the cowboy, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space, trying to buy time to assess his options. "I ain't throwing out no guns yet a while," he finished defiantly. Haywood shouted angrily from outside, his voice rising in pitch. "I got plenty of counts to prove against you in court," the lawyer yelled. "You murdered Jim Dupar in front of witnesses, after he objected to you passing a fake coin on him, which same coin we're holding as evidence," he finished, the lie hanging heavy in the air. Rip snarled bitterly in the feeble candlelight, the accusations a mockery of justice. "Furthermore," the lawyer went on, his voice dripping with malice, "you pinked Tipper, the bartender, when he was in the pursuit of his duty, and you committed burglary busting into Chuck Foster's wine cellar," he added, piling on the false charges. "All in all, we got enough to arrest you on, all right." Rip Campbell's guns were in his calloused hands now, the cold steel a comfort in the face of such overwhelming odds. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Haywood's proposition of mercy, the promise of a fair trial, was a calculated lie, a thinly veiled attempt to lure him out into the open where he could be murdered without witnesses, another victim silenced. "Go to blazes," Rip shouted, his voice ringing with defiance. "If you want me, come in and haul me out of here." Rip crossed the cramped room, his boots silent on the earthen floor, to put his back to the wall opposite the thick door, seeking any tactical advantage he could find. He doubted if Haywood, even with his blustering threats, could batter the solid door down, especially with the heavy whiskey keg blocking the knob, a small but significant obstacle. Haywood's shrill voice, laced with impatience, reached his ears again, cutting through the tense silence. "One more chance to open up," the lawyer warned. "Then we'll start sieving that closet with rifle slugs from Foster's private office, turning this place into a shooting gallery. "We know we can't bust this door down," he admitted. "But we can keep peppering away with rifles until we get you," he finished, the threat clear and unambiguous. Sweat, cold and clammy, dripped down the hard line of Rip Campbell's jaw, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. The showdown, the inevitable confrontation, had come. Tucker Haywood, the cunning lawyer, had discovered a way to slay him, a way that was both brutal and effective. "Shoot and be danged, Haywood," shouted the cowboy defiantly, bracing himself for the coming onslaught. As he braced his wide-spread legs, his high-heeled boot felt one of the floorboards shake loosely beneath him, a slight tremor in the solid earth. In a flash of inspiration, a desperate idea sparking in his mind, Rip Campbell believed he saw a scant chance for escape, a slim hope of survival, before Haywood began drilling the walls with deadly slugs. Already he could hear the heavy tread of men, the shuffling of feet, as they trooped into Chuck Foster's private office, located alongside the thin wall of the wine closet, preparing for the assault. Going into action swiftly, wasting no precious time, Rip Campbell took a heavy iron bung starter, a tool used for opening barrels from a rusty wall hook. The iron, cold against his sweaty palm, got to his knees and pried it under the end of the loose floorboard, his muscles straining. Sweat beaded his face, dripping into his eyes, as he struggled at the stubborn board, the wood resisting his efforts, until the end was finally loose enough for him to get his fingers under it and tug upward, the nails screaming in protest. This accomplished, Rip, his movements now quick and efficient, swept a row of wine bottles, their glass sea-liling softly to the dusty floor to clear a section of the wall shelf, creating a makeshift workspace, and jerked loose the rough-hewn board serving as the shelf, the wood splintering slightly. This board, sturdy and thick, he carefully put under the loosened plank in the floor, creating a makeshift lever to pry loose the remaining nails, his mind racing. He knew he was fighting against time, every second precious. Already he could distinctly hear Tucker Haywood, his voice harsh and triumphant, pulling rifles from a wall rack inside Foster's office. Chapter 11. The fatal day of the mortgage foreclosure arrived. A day heavy with dread, without Rip having received a word from his father in reply to his desperate plea for a loan to save the Ramble Range. Cowhands who had ridden into Ferndale for supplies had brought back the ranch mail during the intervening 2 weeks, but along with it, they carried the insidious whispers, the carefully crafted story circulated by Tucker Haywood to prevent Sheriff Lyle Durwood from investigating the suspicious shooting scrape that had occurred in Foster's saloon during his absence. Haywood, ever the conniving lawyer, had concocted a plausible enough tale for the sheriff's trusting ears. According to the wattle-necked lawyer, the volatile fast-hand gunny Jim Dupar had suddenly gone loco from consuming too much rot-gut whiskey, a fiery concoction known to ignite tempers and loosen tongues, and had, in a fit of drunken madness, shot 2 unsuspecting men and wounded the hapless bartender before being cornered like a rabid dog and killed in Foster's own liquor closet. Inasmuch as Jim Dupar, a known troublemaker, and the other dead men were considered a good riddance to the town, a purging of unwanted elements, Sheriff Durwood, overworked and trusting, had accepted the story as fact, at least for the time being. Rip Campbell's demanding duties at the sprawling ranch, a constant struggle against the elements and the ever-present threat of rustlers, kept him tied to the land and prevented him from visiting the county seat to give his friend, the sheriff, his version of the facts, a version that might well have shed a different light on the tragic events. As the fateful morning of the 15th dawned, painting the desert sky in hues of fiery orange and dusty rose, Rip Campbell could no longer contain his gnawing anxiety. He saddled up his trusty steed, a spirited buckskin named Dusty, and rode with a growing sense of urgency to town, making straight for the dusty ramshackle post office, the heart of Ferndale's communication network. "Reckon you know what day this is, Rip," jeered Tucker Haywood, his voice dripping with thinly veiled malice as he passed the anxious-faced cowboy his meager mail. "At midnight, I'm moving you off the Ramble Range, unless you plank down $10,000, a small fortune, to cover Foster's mortgage," he finished, his words a cold reminder of the impending doom. Rip's ice-blue eyes, usually friendly and welcoming, speared the Cowtown lawyer in silent contempt, his gaze a mixture of anger and desperation, as he turned on his heel and left the post office without a word. He crossed the dusty, rutted street to the sheriff's office, a small, unassuming building that represented the only semblance of law and order in the wild and untamed town, to read his mail, hoping against hope for a miracle. "Any news from your dad, Rip?" inquired the kindly sheriff, his voice filled with genuine concern. "Time's getting almighty short," he added, his words echoing the cowboy's own fears. Durwood was a giant of a hombre, a towering figure of a man with straw-yellow hair, thick and unruly, and bushy brows like frayed lariat hemp, a testament to a life lived outdoors. He packed his .45 Colts with the easy confidence of a born gunman, his hand never far from the worn leather holsters, and the star that gleamed on his open vest, a symbol of authority, was the only force of law in Scorpion Basin strong enough to back up those guns and maintain a semblance of peace. "Yep, here's a letter from Santa Fe," cried Rip Campbell, his heart pumping wildly with a surge of hope, as he found a letter in his father's familiar handwriting, the sight a welcome relief in the sea of uncertainty. "Gosh, I hope it's got good news about that loan," he muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. In the act of opening the letter, Rip frowned, a shadow of doubt crossing his brow. The flap on the envelope, he noticed, had been smeared in closing, a small but unsettling detail, for there was a shiny mark where it had been gummed down originally. Had his father, in his haste, opened it to add something to his message, some last-minute instruction or reassurance? Eagerness to get the message, to know his fate, put the unsettling matter from the cowboy's mind. However, as he tore open the envelope with trembling fingers and read aloud, his voice filled with anticipation. "Dear Rip, it's taken me longer than I figured to get that $10,000 together, but it'll be in the Wells Fargo stage that arrives in Ferndale late Tuesday evening, the 15th. If nothing goes wrong, the dinero will be waiting for you before the midnight deadline, when this Foster Yahoo clamps down on the murder mortgage he holds on the Ramble Range. Best of luck, and write me pronto about how things turn out. Your dad, Buckaroo Rip." Rip folded the note, his relief quickly giving way to a renewed sense of worry, a dark cloud settling over his hopes. "Does that stagecoach keep its schedule usually, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice laced with anxiety. Durwood scratched a grizzled jaw, his expression mirroring Rip's concern. "Dang seldom, Rip," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "The old Smoky Trail is rough and blazes, full of treacherous curves and hidden dangers. That dang stage is due here tonight, but she's just as apt to pull in tomorrow morning or later, or maybe not at all," he finished, his words a chilling reminder of the uncertainties of life on the frontier. A chill, colder than the desert night, ran through Rip Campbell's veins. "That'd be too late," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Tucker Haywood just reminded me, with a sneer on his face, that he'd be out to the ranch at midnight to kick me off the spread so's Chuck Foster could take possession," he explained, the image of Haywood's gloating face burning in his mind. Before the sheriff could reply, offer some word of comfort or advice, Rip Campbell remembered the queer look of the envelope flap, the unsettling detail he had noticed earlier. He eyed it more closely, his gaze now sharp and suspicious. "Sheriff," he said tensely, his voice low and urgent, "I think this letter has been steamed open. It got here on yesterday's stage, according to the postmark, and I wouldn't be surprised if Tucker Haywood opened it, being as how he works for Chuck Foster and is always lurking around the post office." Lyle Durwood, his brow furrowed in concern, turned the envelope over and over in his large hands, examining it carefully, then glanced at a rusty alarm clock, its face cracked and faded, on his cluttered desk. "I wouldn't put nothing past that tucker-necked buzzard across the street," agreed the lawman, his voice filled with disgust. "Rip, I realize what you got at stake if that stagecoach shows up even 5 minutes after midnight, the fate of your ranch hanging in the balance. But I got a scheme, a plan that'll save your ranch if you're willing to take a risk," he finished, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I'm plumb glad to hear that, Sheriff," Rip replied, his voice filled with relief. "We'll meet the stage," Durwood exclaimed. "We'll ride to Spearhead Springs, a remote outpost over at the edge of the Scorpion Rim, where the stagecoach stops to water the horses. When the coach stops there, we'll get your money, directly from the strongbox. Me being with you will give the driver the authority, the confidence, to turn over the dinero without question. Then no matter how late the coach gets here, you'll have the money in your hands, safe and sound, and you'll pay off that mortgage before the stroke of midnight," he finished, his plan laid out clearly. Rip smiled gratefully, a genuine smile this time, as he saw Lyle Durwood, a man of action, put on his dusty Stetson, the symbol of his authority, and hitch up the heavy gun belts about his big waist, preparing for the ride. They headed out to their tethered horses together, their footsteps echoing on the wooden boardwalk, and a few minutes later were dusting out of Ferndale, leaving the small town behind them, to meet the Wells Fargo stagecoach and hopefully secure Rip's future. At the same time, back in the dimly lit, smoke-filled private office of Chuck Foster's saloon, Tucker Haywood, his face etched with greed, was having a clandestine conference with his crooked boss, the man who held Rip's fate in his hands. The two men, conspirators in a scheme to rob Rip of his inheritance, were rereading a copy of Buckaroo Rip's letter, the second communication which Haywood, abusing his position of trust, had steamed open in his post office, violating the sanctity of the mail. "The money'll be aboard that coach, according to this," chuckled Haywood, his voice filled with anticipation. "But when the stage gets to town," he added, a sly glint in his eyes, "the money can't be aboard." Chuck Foster, his lips wrapped around his ever-present frayed cigar, chewed thoughtfully on the end. Chapter 12. The dusty old Concord stagecoach, its faded red paint peeling and its leather seats, cracked with age, which lied the bustling Scorpion Basin with the more civilized south-central part of Arizona, jounced and swayed its way precariously through the dry, rutted bed of the Rio Amarillo. A burly, red-bearded guard, his face weathered and tough, cradling a stubby shotgun across his lap, sat beside the gaunt, squinting driver. Two mounted deputy sheriffs from the nearby town of La Catula, their horses snorting and stamping, accompanied the stagecoach on horseback, riding point ahead of the six-horse team. "That shows the gold's aboard," chuckled Tucker Haywood, a figure of menace lurking in his ambush on the South Rim rock 100 yards ahead, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "Get ready for action, boys." Across the Rio Amarillo's narrow, winding gulch, hidden amongst the gnarled scrub mesquites and the spiky, sentinel-like Ocotillo cactus clumps, two swarthy Mexican killers, their brown serapes blending seamlessly with the sun-parched, arid background, lay in wait, their patience honed by years of living on the edge. Tucker Haywood, a picture of malevolent intent, squatted on the opposite rim rock behind a massive gray granite boulder, its surface rough and speckled. The evil lawyer from Ferndale, a man known for his cunning and his cruelty, had his 6 guns drawn and ready in his calloused hands, and at his shoulder, a lean and hungry shadow, was Slick Henderson, a scrawny-faced gunslinger, his eyes cold and calculating, who was also on Chuck Foster's payroll, a hired killer ready to do his master's bidding. "Okay, boys. Handle them guards, you says," Haywood hissed, his voice low and urgent. As the creaky, lumbering stagecoach, its wheels groaning in protest, drew nearer, Haywood, his face hidden by a dark blue bandana, adjusted the makeshift mask about his hawkish features, his eyes glittering behind the cloth. The other 3 dry gulchers, equally masked, followed suit, their movements quick and efficient. They did not want to be recognized. Anonymity was their shield. They had chosen a narrow, treacherous spot in the dry riverbed, about 2 miles up mountain from the relative safety of Spearhead Springs, a place where the road was so rough and uneven that it forced the coach to a creeping, vulnerable pace. "Reckon we'll get to Ferndale ahead of schedule today," came the high, cackling voice of the driver, his tone light and carefree, as he squinted at the westering sun which poured its fiery light full into their squinting, tired eyes. "I'll be glad, carrying this." Brrrang! A gunshot, sharp and sudden, blasted out, shattering the stifling heat of the dying day, and as if by magic, the driver's hat, a battered and worn Stetson, whipped off his bald knob of a head, a chillingly accurate shot. At the exact same instant, Tucker Haywood, his face a mask of predatory glee, stood up on the rim rock, his figure silhouetted against the sky, level with the top of the coach. Smoking guns, their barrels still hot, were held steady in his calloused hands. "Grab a cloud, buskies," came the masked lawyer's snarl, his voice harsh and menacing. "We won't plug nobody if you don't get boogery with your hog legs." The two startled deputies on horseback, their faces etched with surprise and fear, yanked their Winchesters from their scabbards, their movements jerky and panicked. Instantly, as if on cue, came the roar of heavy guns on the opposite rim, the deadly reports echoing through the canyon, as the two hidden Mexicans, their serapes now discarded, got into brutal action. The two guards' horses, spooked and terrified, began to buck and rear, their hooves churning the dry earth, as the deputies, caught off guard, threw up their hands in surrender and tumbled out of their saddles, landing hard on the unforgiving ground. In the meantime, the red-whiskered shotgun guard, his face a picture of grim determination, had jumped to his feet, his stubby shotgun leveled menacingly at Haywood and Slick Henderson. But the lawyer and his partner, their eyes cold and focused, had concentrated their attention on the guard, knowing the Mexicans would finish off the deputies, their fate sealed. Spang! Haywood and the slim gunhawk at his elbow, their movements practiced and deadly, fired as one, the sound of the gunshots merging into a single, devastating report. 4 slugs, hot and lethal, dropped the stage guard in his tracks, the force of the impact throwing him off balance. He fell over the footboard, his lifeless arms dangling toward the whiffletrees, as the driver, his face pale and drawn, struggled desperately to control the startled and panicked team, their eyes wide with terror. As if they were acting out a well-rehearsed play, a macabre ballet of death, Tucker Haywood and his scrawny companion, their movements fluid and practiced, slid down the bank, their guns covering the interior of the stagecoach, their eyes scanning for any sign of resistance. But it was empty of passengers who might cause trouble, their absence a stroke of good fortune for the outlaws. "Just hold them nags, driver," advised Tucker Haywood, his voice cold and menacing, as he climbed up the front wheel of the stagecoach and covered the terrified driver with his drawn .45. "We won't hurt you none if you don't get ringy," he added, the threat hanging heavy in the air. The driver, his hands full with the frantic team, offered no objections, his head bobbing in silent agreement as he struggled to maintain control. He had seen enough death for one day. Tucker Haywood, his eyes gleaming with avarice, reached under the ragged canvas flap of the stage boot and rummaged among the sacks of mail, his fingers searching for the prize. Disregarding the red-striped canvas bags which he knew contained valuable registered mail, the lifeblood of commerce, Tucker withdrew a small wooden box, sealed with tin straps and bearing the unmistakable labels of the Wells Fargo Co. It was addressed to Rip Campbell. "Reckon this box is full of gold," chuckled Tucker Haywood, his voice loud and clear, making sure that the driver would be sure and hear the message intended for his ears. "Reckon we better be hightailing it across the border, amigos," he said, turning to his accomplices. Scrambling back up the slope of the Rio Amarillo's shale bank, their movements quick and efficient, Tucker Haywood vanished into the thick brush in the direction of the draw where the gang's horses were waiting, eager to escape with their loot. He was followed by the 2 Mexicans and Slick Henderson, who stood guard until the last, making sure their retreat was covered, and then motioned for the shaken driver to leave the country if he wished to survive, a silent warning. Filled with horror, his nerves stretched to the breaking point as he found himself alone in the corpse-strewn canyon. The driver of the looted mail coach, his hands trembling, jerked his foot off the brake, releasing the pent-up tension, and let the frantic, terrified team leap ahead, their hooves pounding the dry earth. Rocketing around treacherous curves on 2 wheels, the stagecoach, its wooden frame groaning in protest, overtook the 2 snorting, riderless horses with empty saddles, the mounts of the deputy sheriffs, whose lifeless corpses were now collecting flies back up the desolate canyon, a grim reminder of the violence that had just transpired. In a swirling cloud of dust, and with an ear-banging clatter, The coach careened around a widening bend in the Rio Amarillo's dry gorge and approached an open flat area which was thickly overgrown with cottonwood trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze, willow bushes, their branch swaying gently, and hardy salt cedars, their roots clinging tenaciously to the arid soil. Tall, imposing cliffs, their rock faces weathered and scarred, shimmered in the intense heat of the sinking sun, casting long shadows across the parched landscape. It was here, at the tranquil oasis of Spearhead Springs, that the Indians in ancient times had patiently chipped out their arrowheads and tomahawk blades, crafting their tools of survival from the very stone of the earth. The team, their initial burst of terror finally exhausted, came to a halt, their sides heaving, with foam dripping from the harness, a few feet from the dense underbrush, a welcome respite from their frantic flight. The chaparral, thick and impenetrable, parted to reveal two surprised-looking men, their faces etched with concern, one a giant of a man with blond hair, his features rugged, and the other a wiry young cowpuncher with a rugged, freckled face, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "What's this, Uncle Joe?" cried Sheriff Durwood, his voice booming across the still air. "What's wrong with your guard there?" Uncle Joe, the bald-headed driver, his face pale and drawn, wrapped his lines about the whipstock securing the team, and did a flying leap from the seat to the ground, his movements quick and urgent. He pointed with a trembling finger to the crimson drops, dark and ominous, seeping through a crack in the worn footboard, under the lifeless corpse of the shotgun guard. Chapter 13. Grim-faced, tight-lipped, the two riders pushed on up the dusty canyon until they reached the bodies of the two deputy sheriffs, which told them where the holdup had occurred. Uncle Joe said, as how the desperados headed toward Mexico, commented Lyle Durwood. "So we'll hunt on the south bank and see if we cut any snake sign, Rip." It was easy enough to read where the four bandits had scrambled up the shale bank into the boulders. A short hunt revealed the hoof and boot marks in a brush-choked barranca nearby, where the four crooks had tethered their horses. Long shadows were stealing across the Badlands as they began following the trail through the sparse greasewood and cactus. The sun was sinking in a riot of color above the western rim of Scorpion Basin, where the distant California mountaintops were faint and purple in the gauzy haze. Soon, they knew, it would be too dark to travel and follow the sign. Rip and his lawman friend also realized that while they could resume the trail with the coming of daylight, that would be too late. In 6 more hours, the mortgage on the Ramble Range would be foreclosed. The midnight hour would make due Rip Campbell's murder mortgage, the $10,000 claim which Chuck Foster held against the ranch. And that spread was the last barrier between Chuck Foster and the complete dictatorship of Scorpion Basin's cow business. The trail followed for 2 miles along the base of the towering red cliffs, which marked the eastern edge of the basin. The fact that the night breeze off the desert country had not erased the tracks in the sand showed the two riders that their bandit quarry could not be far ahead of them. This indicated that the stage robbers had not dreamed of such prompt pursuit on the part of Sheriff Lyle Durwood. They had no way of knowing that Durwood and Rip had ridden as far out as Spearhead Springs to meet the stage. "We're licked, Rip," groaned the sheriff. "Night's here." Darkness was falling like lavender mist over the range, and Rip Campbell realized with a despairing heart that Durwood was right. Further trailing was impossible. They dared not ride on in the general direction of Mexico in the hope of picking up the trail later. The outlaw band might cut due east into the Big Smokies if they were an outside bunch, or, as Rip secretly suspected, head for their lair in Ferndale. "Look, Sheriff!" cried Rip Campbell in a low voice as their horses toiled to the summit of a hogback rise. "I thought I saw a light flicker down in that draw just ahead." The two manhunters stiffened in their saddles as they saw a tiny pinpoint of flame in a black sink beyond them, followed by an upleaping burst of crackling red flame. A campfire was being lighted down in that barranca. The pungent odor of burning creosote weed wafted to their nostrils. "I'll bet a bushel of pesetas them's our bandits, camping for the night," gasped Sheriff Durwood. "They're mighty sure of themselves." They reined their horses back under the brow of the rise, so as not to be skylined against the star-sprinkled heavens. Saddle leather creaked as the two men dismounted, tying their horses to juniper snags. "Be sure your smoke poles are loaded for bear," whispered the sheriff. "We'll jump them killers in their own camp." The bandit lair, if it belonged to the men they were chasing, was a quarter of a mile away. They made their way through the intervening chaparral, taking a half-hour to creep to the mouth of the draw. Tobacco smoke was in the air. Horses whickered under the barranca rim. Low muttering voices reached their straining ears. "You watch the head of the gulch here, Rip," whispered the sheriff. "I'll go down there and arrest that bunch." Rip fell in step at the lawman's shoulder. His heart stirred with admiration for the man who had daring enough to go out alone against 4-to-1 odds. "Gracias, but I ain't staying no place," answered Rip of Santa Fe. "It may be your duty to catch them sidewinders, Durwood, but it's my dinero you're risking your hide to get back. If there's any gunplay, count me into the last chip." They moved apart as they neared the campfire. Not 50 feet away, at the edge of the flames, two cone-hatted Mexicans squatted by the fire, busy with skillets. For a moment, Rip had the uneasy feeling that perhaps these were not the hombres who had held up the stagecoach that afternoon. What if it was but a sheep herder's camp, or a prospecting outfit? It was an instant later that a scrawny-faced gringo, on the opposite side of the fire, caught sight of light shimmering off the badge on Sheriff Lyle Durwood's vest. With a hoarse bellow of warning, the gringo dived for his rifle lying across his saddle nearby. Burrum! Sheriff Durwood's guns blazed out, and the gringo clutched a bullet-creased elbow. The two Mexicans dropped their frying pans and whirled, guns spraying the night with bullets from 6 guns which had leapt from their holsters. Bracing himself for the shock of tearing lead, Rip Campbell triggered his Colt .45s with ruthless precision. He saw one Mex drop flopping, knee smashed by a slug. The other spun about and pitched backward, shoulder grazed by one of Rip's bullets. "Close in on him, Rip." "We got him." Durwood leapt out into the circle of firelight, but Rip hesitated, his metal blue eyes shuttling the darkness. The stage driver had said there were 4 bandits involved in the robbery. Where was the 4th man? No shot rang out from any lookout in the surrounding gloom. The firelight traced the ruddy outlines of 3 horses, unsaddled and busy cropping grass under the barranca walls. Sheriff Durwood leapt grimly among the wounded hombres, disarming them and tossing 6 guns into the fire. He kicked the gringo's rifle into the outer murk and stood beside the campfire with 6 guns weaving. "What in blazes you doin', Sheriff?" whined the lanky hombre, whom Durwood recognized as Slick Henderson, one of the barflies who hung around Chuck Foster's saloon in Ferndale. "Can't a man do a little honest prospecting without being trailed by a salty tin badge?" Rip Campbell walked up to the fire, his eyes staring at a little pile of tin straps girdling the charred remains of a wooden box, such as express companies use. "They've got my dinero somewhere, Lyle," growled Rip Campbell. "These are the bandits, all right, not prospectors. See the remains of that money box that they busted open." Slick Henderson, still squeezing his crimson-drenched sleeve, leered at the Ramble Range owner. "Yeah," he taunted. "If you think we got any dinero of yours, go ahead and find it, Busky. But I'm afraid, Sheriff, that you're going to have to turn us 3 loose for lack of evidence. You can't prove we ain't prospecting." Rip Campbell made a careful search of the outlaw's saddle, bedrolls, and grub box. There was no trace of evidence to prove that these were stage robbers, except the crumbling remains of the box they had destroyed in the campfire. "I got enough evidence to hang these skunks," growled the sheriff, "by matching the hoofs of their horses with the tracks by the robbery. But it's that money I'm worried about, Rip." Convinced that the missing loot was not at the bandit camp, Rip of Santa Fe turned to his sheriff friend. "You keep a close hobble on these 3 rattlesnakes, Lyle," he said, "while I go gunning for the leader of this outfit. I got a danged good hunch who he is and where he's headed. Adios." Leaving Sheriff Lyle Durwood with his 3 wounded prisoners in the lonely camp, Rip Campbell headed at a run out of the barranca, bound for Grazer and a long ride across Scorpion Basin. Chapter 14. Haywood was grinning into the night breeze as he tooled his wiry horse along a little used trail across Scorpion Basin, toward the town of Ferndale. So completely dark was the night, with clouds blowing in from the Mojave country to finally blot out the stars, that the evil lawyer was often forced to ride at a walk. Haywood felt that victory was complete. He believed that Sheriff Lyle Durwood would not hear of the stagecoach robbery until nearly midnight, and that the lawman could not start trailing the killers until dawn the next day. The lawyer had purposely divided from Slick Henderson and their 2 Mexican helpers, who would camp overnight and then head deep into the Big Smoky Range, being careful to make tracks which Durwood would follow, perhaps for days. In the meantime, Haywood would be safe in Ferndale, with the loot which he now carried in his saddlebags. The only direct proof that would lile him with the stagecoach robbery was the Wells Fargo box, which had contained the gold belonging to Rip Campbell, and Haywood had seen to it that the box had been destroyed. "Reckon I'll deliver this cash to the boss, and then shag out to the Ramble Range," chuckled Tucker Haywood as he loped on toward Ferndale through the inky night. "It'll sure be a pleasure, kicking that Rip Campbell hombre off his spread. Too bad I didn't squash the jigger, though, when I tumbled the rocking stone down that ravine the other day." Several times the shifting wind, whipping sand on the back of his long, wattled neck, brought to the crook's ears what sounded like the far-off drumming of hoofbeats, but he cast off his anxiety as unfounded. In a few more hours, the loot in his saddlebags would be safe with Chuck Foster. By no stretch of the imagination could the stage robbery ever be traced to Tucker Haywood. The lights of Ferndale finally appeared through the dark. Tucker Haywood struck a match to get the time from his watch. The gold hands pointed to 11:45. "Only 15 minutes to the deadline time for Rip Campbell's mortgage," exclaimed the lawyer, a feeling of exultation warming his arteries. "Time sure slipped up on me crossing this range." He could visualize Rip Campbell out at the Ramble Range ranch house, sweating with anxiety and despair at the failure of his father's loan to show up. Riding into the cow town by a back trail, Tucker Haywood was careful not to be seen or heard by any of the cowboys who were on the main street. He tied his lathered and jaded horse behind the Spurs and Saddles saloon and knocked at the back door of the gambling dive. The mozo who admitted him told Haywood that Chuck Foster had gone home, intending to get a few hours' sleep, and then ride out at sunrise to inspect his new ranch. "Reckon this is important enough to wake the boss up for," chuckled Haywood as he unstrapped his saddlebags containing the stagecoach loot. "Besides, I got to get rid of this dinero." The crooked lawyer made his way down an alley skirting the Mexican quarter of town, then turned and followed a wheel-rutted street until he came to the Spanish-type house where the wealthy saloon keeper made his private residence. Its green lawns and hedged-in patio made it the finest home in Scorpion Basin. A light burned in an upstairs window above Foster's door. Yapping dogs rushed across the lawn at the lawyer's approach, attracting the attention of the man in the upstairs bedroom. A moment later, Chuck Foster's shirtless form blocked the window. "It's Haywood, boss," called up the lawyer softly. "I got what I went after. Thought I'd turn it over to you, and then ride out to the Ramble Range and kick Rip Campbell off the ranch." Chuck Foster's chuckling voice answered him. "Wait till I pull my pants on, Haywood," said the evil gambler. "I'll come downstairs in a jiffy and get that dinero." Haywood saw his boss leave the window. The tucker-necked lawyer lowered the gold-laden saddlebags and rubbed his hands together with satisfaction. His fee for tonight's work would be $5,000, which Foster would be glad to pay. A spur jingled in the darkness behind him. With a start, Tucker Haywood whirled to see who could have followed him unheard across the lawn. A soft drawl met his ears. "Buenos noches, Haywood." Standing in the bar of lamplight from Foster's second-story bedroom was a tall young cowboy in moleskin pants, gray Stetson, and gaudy Navajo vest. "Rip Campbell," gasped the crooked lawyer. The Santa Fe cowboy nodded. His guns were in their calf-leg holsters at his thighs, his hands hooked in his cartridge belts. "What are you doing here, this time of night?" gasped Tucker Haywood, his heart racing. "I've come for my dinero, that's all," answered the cowboy. Haywood felt panic clawing at him. He fought to control his gasping lungs. "What you mean, Rip? What dinero?" Rip was smiling. It was not a pleasant smile. "I figured you would hightail it for Foster's place as soon as you robbed that stage," rasped the cowboy in a deadly monotone. "So I've been following you across the desert, Haywood. You had a 10-minute head start of me from that bandit camp, but I had a better horse, so I caught up with you." A hoarse yell of terror came from Haywood's scrawny throat. He knew now that he had heard hoofbeats behind him. Then the lawyer seemed to go loco. His talon-like fingers darted down to close about the cedar butts of his 6 guns, jerked them frantically from their holsters. Not until the lawyer was thumbing back the knurled hammers of the Colts did Rip Campbell's lazy pose change and his hands loosen themselves from his cartridge belts. Then, in the bile of an eye, the cowboy from Santa Fe had both 6 guns leveled and spitting flame and smoke. Brrrang! Bang, 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 bang! Firing coolly, first from the left gun, then from the right, Rip Campbell went to work on the crooked lawyer who had schemed to double-cross him and cheat him of the Ramble Range ranch. Bullet holes appeared like a row of red buttons up Haywood's chest, drilled twice through his red-wattled, scrawny neck, punched a hole between his eyes and another in the center of his forehead. Driven backward by the impact of 8 driving chunks of lead, Tucker Haywood stumbled over a low hedge bordering the gravel path and fell out of sight, a bullet-torn wreck which the dogs shied away from, barking furiously. The house door swung open, flooding the pathway with light. Chuck Foster stood there, one hand holding up his trousers, the other bearing a kerosene lamp. "Cut out the noise, Haywood," growled Foster. "I know it is our night to howl, but you oughtn't to be celebrating by popping off your cutters like a drunken ranny on 4th of." Chuck Foster broke off as he caught sight of Rip Campbell strolling up the path, carrying a pair of saddlebags. It was the first time the 2 men had met face to face since Rip had arrived in Arizona. "Rip," gasped the would-be cattle baron, falling back against the door jamb. "What are you doing here? I thought Tucker Haywood was down here." Rip Campbell shook his head. His eyes were steely slits. "Must be some mistake, Foster," drawled the cowboy from New Mexico as he halted at the doorstep. "Haywood ain't around." Somewhere in the house behind Chuck Foster, a clock began striking the hour of midnight. Foster kept his eyes glued on the smoke which seeped out of Rip Campbell's holsters. "Midnight of Tuesday the 15th, Foster," reminded Rip Campbell as the clock stopped tolling. "Your murder mortgage was due tonight, you may recollect. And here's your $10,000 in cash, on the line." Rip Campbell was now the sole owner of the Ramble Range ranch.